Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really pull apart the week's news and find the bits that matter most. This week, we're digging into Ghana's economy, specifically for the week ending April 26th, 2025. We've gone through a lot of reports to, well, find the key insights for you.
Exactly. It's not just about the headlines, is it? We
Yeah.
want to understand the why behind these economic shifts.
Yeah.
We've looked at everything from, global forecasts, IMF, World Bank stuff, right down to local indicators here in Ghana.
Yep. And to help make sense of it all, we've kind of grouped things into five main areas. Economic stability first,
Hmm.
then growth and job creation, taxation and revenue, trade and investment, and finally, infrastructure and the digital economy. Those are our sort of signposts for today.
Perfect. And we're judging everything on, well, accuracy, relevance right now, timeliness, and crucially, the potential impact.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean? We've got info from the IMF, the World Bank, Bank of Ghana, news reports, trying to get that rounded view.
Okay, great. Let's jump right in then. Big news on the growth front, IMF and World Bank revisions.
Yes, that's definitely a key story this week. Both of them have revised Ghana's 2025 GDP growth forecast downwards. It's now below the government's own target of 4.4%.
Oh, okay. So what are the new numbers? Are they close?
Pretty close, yeah. The IMF is now saying 4.0% growth for this year,
4.0.
and the World Bank is just a fraction lower at 3.9%.
Right. 3.9. So why the downgrade? Are they seeing the same problems?
Largely yes, but with slightly different emphasis, you could say. The IMF is pointing to a slower recovery than they'd hoped for in agriculture and energy, plus those external factors we keep hearing about. Higher borrowing costs globally, tighter financial conditions, shaky commodity prices, all that stuff.
Yeah, those global headwinds really bite. And the World Bank, what's their angle?
They're definitely highlighting the inflation issue within Ghana is still persistent. And external vulnerabilities, too, like rising commodity prices and slower global demand. But what's really interesting and maybe a bit worrying is they explicitly mention climate change.
Ah!
They're seeing climate disruptions hitting cocoa and agriculture, not just in Ghana, but Côte d'Ivoire, too. And that has knock-on effects, obviously.
So thinking about these lower growth numbers, what does that mean for, say, jobs or just general economic well-being?
Well, it's certainly not great news for job creation. Slower growth usually means fewer new jobs, and it could slow down poverty reduction efforts. It's a real concern.
Is it all doom and gloom, though, or is there any sign of things picking up later, a medium-term view?
There is some cautious optimism, I'd say. Both the IMF and World Bank see growth picking up again in the next couple of years. The IMF projects 4.8% in 2026. The World Bank sees 4.6% in 26, maybe hitting 4.8% in 2027.
Okay, but what's the catch? What does that depend on?
Right. It's conditional. It really hinges on, well, better business conditions, managing those external risks we talked about, and crucially, the government sticking to its fiscal consolidation plan, managing debt and deficits.
Got it. So a lot needs to go right. What about inflation? That's been a real headache.
Yeah, and the IMF forecast isn't exactly comforting there. They're projecting end-of-year inflation for 2025 at 17.5%.
Wow, 17.5%. That's way above the government's target of, what, 11.9%?
Exactly. So hitting that official target looks like a very steep climb.
Yeah.
And that level of inflation really eats into people's purchasing power.
No kidding. And the debt, always a big topic. Debt to GDP ratio.
Okay, so both institutions see the debt-to-GDP ratio climbing this year, hitting around 66.4% by year-end.
Right, so up from the current level, which was about
61.8% at the end of December 2024. So, yes, an increase in the short term. But importantly, they do project it starting to come down afterwards, around 62.7% in 2026, and the World Bank even sees it potentially dipping below 60% in 2027.
Okay, so a near-term bump, but then a downward trend predicted. What's the benefit of that downward trend, practically speaking?
Well, a lower debt ratio generally gives the government more breathing room, more fiscal space. It means potentially more money for services like health, education, infrastructure, rather than just servicing debt.
And it probably helps with investor confidence, too.
Absolutely. Lower debt is usually seen as a sign of better economic management, which makes investors feel more secure.
Okay. Were there any other sort of positive signals or developments mentioned in these reports?
Yes, actually. One key thing is the new Public Financial Management Amendment Act. It just passed.
Right. What's the aim there?
Basically to tighten up budget discipline and make government finances more transparent. That's a really foundational step for better fiscal governance. Should help build trust.
That sounds good. And anything happening on the ground business-wise? Any indicators?
Yeah, the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, it's looking a bit better. It went from 47.9 in January up to 50.6 in March.
And over 50 means?
Expansion. So it suggests business activity is picking up slightly, maybe supply bottlenecks easing, a bit more confidence returning. It's a positive sign, definitely.
That is welcome news, a tangible positive.
And the finance minister also talked about plans to clear last year's government payables backlog. Plus, reinforcing fiscal discipline, transparency. They've even got this revised debt rule aiming for a 45% debt to GDP ratio way down the line by 2035.
Wow, that's a long-term goal. So tying it all together, that lower debt ratio really helps the average person by freeing up government spending, potentially.
In theory, yes. More fiscal space means more potential investment in public services that directly impact you. Plus, the boost to investor confidence can eventually lead to more jobs and opportunities. Makes sense.
It does. Now, going back to that climate change point you raised earlier, how serious is that threat right now?
Oh, it's very serious, especially for agriculture. Think cocoa, unpredictable weather hits yields, and that directly impacts Ghana's export earnings. Big time. And if local food production suffers too, you get higher food prices, which fuels overall inflation. It hits everyone's pockets.
Right. So given all this, the challenges, the positives, what should the government really be focusing on now? Key priorities.
Okay, several things stand out. First, keep pushing on tax reforms, broadening the base, especially getting the informal sector more involved. That's vital for revenue.
Okay. What else?
Second, strengthening those public financial management institutions, making sure the systems are robust for the long haul.
Right.
Third, continue working on investor confidence, transparent reforms, stable environment that attracts the investment needed for growth.
Makes sense.
And finally, and this is crucial, actively addressing those climate risks in agriculture. Adaptation policies aren't for the future. They're needed now to protect livelihoods and the economy.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk trade and investment. There was news about the U.S. imposing a 10% tariff on some Ghanaian exports.
Yes, that certainly got some attention. And what it really does, I think, is throw a spotlight on the importance of intra-African trade, specifically the AfCFTA.
Right. The African Continental Free Trade Area. How does the U.S. tariff connect?
Well, it's a reminder, isn't it? Relying too heavily on one or two external markets carries risks. This U.S. tariff just underlines why Ghana needs to strengthen trade ties within Africa. Diversification.
So AfCFTA becomes less of a nice-to-have and more of a strategic must-have.
I think so, yeah. And it's not just about cutting tariffs between African countries, remember? It's also about tackling the practical stuff, logistics, regulations, the things that make trade difficult and expensive right now.
And if those hurdles are overcome, what kind of opportunities open up for Ghanaian businesses?
Huge potential, especially in areas like agriculture, textiles, processed goods, think value addition. It fits perfectly with Ghana's push for industrialization, making more things here rather than just exporting raw materials, getting into those regional supply chains.
But isn't Ghana already doing a lot of trade within West Africa, within ECOWAS?
That's a really important point, yes. The GPA report from 2023 showed something like 94, almost 95% of Ghana's non-traditional exports under AfCFTA rules actually went to ECOWAS countries.
Wow, 94%. That's huge. So mostly neighbors-like.
Exactly. Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire are big markets, especially for things like plastic products, apparently. It shows there's already strong regional demand there.
So does that existing ECOWAS trade give Ghana a leg up for the wider AfCFTA?
Absolutely. It shows the National Export Development Strategy is having some effect, and it proves the potential. Ghana can use those existing ECOWAS links as a springboard to reach further across the continent under AfCFTA.
Okay, but we know it's not all smooth sailing. What are the big roadblocks for Ghana really making the most of AfCFTA?
Yeah, there are definitely challenges. Infrastructure is a big one. Roads, ports, digital connections, even customs efficiency. Improvements are happening, but more investment is needed to cut down trade time and cost.
It's not just about the physical stuff, right?
No, exactly. You've got the non-tariff barriers, NTBs, complex regulations, red tape. These can be huge headaches, especially for smaller businesses, the SMEs. And then there's the capacity of Ghanaian SMEs themselves. Can they actually scale up production to meet demand from across Africa? They often need more support, more access to finance to do that.
So quite a few hurdles. What's the strategy then? How does Ghana overcome these?
Well, it needs a focused push. Intensify export promotion, but maybe target specific regions in Africa where Ghana isn't trading much yet. And critically, invest in digital trade infrastructure. Think online platforms for trade documents, e-certificates, better logistics tracking. That can really boost competitiveness across the continent.
Okay, now let's switch focus again. There was the Kwahu Business Forum, KBIF 2025. What was the main theme there?
Yeah, KBIF. What stood out was the real focus on MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises, seeing them as like the engine for future investment and inclusive growth in Ghana.
That makes sense. SMEs are huge employers. What specific topics came up?
Access to finance was front and center. Lots of talk about getting affordable credit to these smaller businesses. The Ghana Development Bank, the proposed Women Development Bank, they're seen as key players here.
Right, capital access is always a big one for SMEs. What else?
Digital infrastructure. Again, strengthening digital financial services, making things easier online. ADB, the Agricultural Development Bank, even showed off new mobile banking and online sign-up tools. So a real push for digitalization.
So finance and tech were specific industries highlighted.
Yes, they pinpointed a few key growth areas: agro-processing, ICT, green energy, and tourism. These are sectors where they see a lot of potential for MSMEs to grow and create jobs.
And was there a focus on making sure everyone benefits, inclusion?
Definitely. Strong emphasis on empowering women and young entrepreneurs. Things like tailored funding, support programs. They mentioned the Feed Ghana initiative, aiming to boost agriculture, but also specifically support young people getting into that sector.
Okay, so lots of positive talk and initiatives discussed. If these actually happen, if they're fully implemented, what's the potential impact?
Oh, it could be pretty significant. You'd expect real growth in the MSME sector, which means more jobs. Better digital access opens up markets, especially outside the main cities. Plus, focusing on those key sectors creates new opportunities. And if it all leads to a more stable investment climate and brings more women and youth into business, you get a much more dynamic, diverse economy overall.
Right. Okay, now for something maybe less positive but very important. Financial fraud. The Bank of Ghana's 2025 fraud report came out. What's the headline?
Yeah, the Bogey report.
Yeah.
The overall trend is, well, a bit concerning. The number of fraud cases went up about 5%, which isn't huge, but the value at risk, that jumped 13% across banks, SDIs, PSPs, the whole lot.
Hold on. So fewer incidents but bigger losses per incident. Is that right?
For the banks, yes, that seems to be the trend. The number of cases reported by banks actually dropped sharply by 26%.
Okay.
But the value at risk for banks rose 19%, hitting GH 75 million. So yeah, fewer cases, but much larger amounts involved. Suggests more sophisticated fraud attempts.
Any particular type of fraud driving that in the banks?
Forgery and document manipulation. That accounted for a massive 67% of the value at risk in banks and the STIs combined. Really highlights a vulnerability there.
Wow. Okay, what about the SDIs, the specialized deposit-taking institutions? Different picture.
Yes, kind of the opposite trend there. SDIs saw a rise in the number of cases, up 43%.
Okay.
But the value at risk actually fell quite a bit, down 48%. So more frequent but smaller value frauds seem to be the issue there. Cash theft is still common, and rural and community banks seem to be seeing more cases.
Interesting. And payment service providers, the PSPs, with everything going digital?
Predictably, they're a growing target. Digital transaction volume's up 19%, value's up 58%, so the pot is bigger. And fraud is following. Cases up 7%, value at risk up 18%. They saw a spike around December last year, probably linked to the holiday season transaction surge.
Doesn't sound like any area is safe. What about staff involvement, insiders?
That's a really troubling part of the report. Staff involvement in fraud within banks and SDIs is up by 33%.
33% increase. Wow. Mostly what kind?
Mostly staff stealing cash, actually. Over 70% of the internal fraud cases. And what's also concerning is that apparently less than half the staff involved were actually dismissed. Raises questions about accountability, doesn't it?
It certainly does if staff aren't facing serious consequences. Okay, what about getting the money back? Recovery rates?
Dismal, frankly. Only about 4% was recovered. That's just GH 3 million out of GH 83 million at risk.
4%? Why so low?
It seems legal delays, the cost of chasing these cases. It might be putting institutions off pursuing recovery aggressively, but the end result is huge losses.
And who gets hit hardest by this? Is it the big institutions or?
Well, the institutions take the financial hit directly, but the report points out that MSMEs are particularly vulnerable. They have fewer resources to absorb losses, and they rely heavily on these payment systems. Fraud can really disrupt their operations.
Right. So what's the Bank of Ghana doing about all this? Any new measures?
Yes, they've issued new directives. For banks and SDIs, it's about strengthening controls, things like dual controls for transactions, mandatory staff rotation in sensitive roles, using multi-factor authentication. Basic, but important stuff.
And for the PSPs, the mobile money operators and such.
For them, it's about better monitoring of their agents, forcing users to change PINs regularly, and, importantly, more public education campaigns about avoiding e-fraud.
Okay, one last area to cover. The Data Protection Commission, the DPC, they're shifting gears towards enforcement.
That's right. They've basically said the awareness campaigns have happened, now it's time for action. They're moving to actively enforce the Data Protection Act from 2012.
Why the shift now?
Well, think about how much more digital everything is. Mobile money, e-commerce, online government services. The amount of personal data being collected and processed is massive, and so are the risks if that data isn't protected properly. So the DPC feels it's time to ensure institutions are actually complying, not just aware of the rules.
Who are they targeting specifically?
Any institution, public or private, that hasn't registered with the DPC like they're supposed to, or isn't meeting the data protection standards in the Act, Act 843.
And if they're caught not complying, what happens?
It could range from inspections and warnings to administrative fines, potentially having their operations suspended, or even facing legal action for serious breaches.
So real teeth behind it now. Will they still do the education side?
Yes, they said the public awareness work will continue alongside enforcement. Educating people about their data rights is still key.
Why is this enforcement push so significant, do you think?
Well, obviously protecting people's privacy is fundamental, but it's also about building trust, especially for growing sectors like fintech, health tech, e-commerce. They rely on users trusting them with data. Strong enforcement can boost investor confidence, too. It signals a mature regulatory environment. It helps build that culture of respecting privacy.
Makes sense. But enforcing this across the board won't be easy, surely. What are the challenges?
Oh, definitely challenges.
Yeah.
The DPC itself will need resources, money, staff to actually do the inspections and follow-ups effectively. That's a big ask. You might get pushback from businesses, especially SMEs, who might see compliance as just another cost.
Right, the cost burden.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if public awareness of data rights is still generally low, people might not know when their rights are violated or how to complain, which could limit how effective enforcement can be.
Okay. Well, that wraps up our deep dive for this week, covering quite a lot of ground on Ghana's economy. It really strikes me how interconnected everything is, The growth forecasts affect investment, which ties into trade opportunities, which rely on digital infrastructure, which is then vulnerable to fraud, undermining stability, while data protection tries to build trust in that same digital space. It all links up.
Absolutely. It's never just one thing, is it? It's always this complex interplay of different factors. Understanding those links is really key.
So a final thought for everyone listening, looking at everything we've discussed, what do you think is the single most critical factor that will shape Ghana's economic path over the next year? Is it the global headwinds, fiscal discipline, climate change, or maybe thinking about all this digitalization? How does it make you think about your own data privacy? Are you taking steps to protect your information online? Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this week's Deep Dive.